Hi, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Ian, and welcome, Rebecca, and welcome to all of you who might be joining us wherever you might be. As we prepared this webinar, we have got to the question early on, why would you be sitting in a conference room or by a phone or at a computer somewhere in the world listening to us talk about this subject, which is both parts emotional if you're involved in a family business, and also economical in that you're thinking about wealth and transitioning wealth and money from one place to another. So our best thinking was that you were either.
Hi, Ian. Ian, this is the operator.
Call it prune the family tree. There we go. Thank you. I learned a lesson in my client work years ago working with a family that has a number of orchards throughout the western United States. And very easy for some family businesses to understand the importance of pruning a shareholder tree, right? Some shareholders don't want to be there. And maybe they inherited shares as a part of an estate plan. And maybe they have other ideas about their lives and their future. So the idea of pruning a tree to an orchard farmer makes plenty of sense, makes the tree healthier, and is better for the long-term success of the whole organization. You might want to grow your business through acquisitions and need cash to do so. You may want to diversify your assets. There are different sort of schools of thought about whether it's best to focus on one core competence in business and to focus on your family business and to manage it in the best way that you can. And others would say diversify your assets. That's something that I would trust Rebecca and her team more than I would myself to give any advice on. But you may just want to diversify assets if you're approaching a transition in your family business and you want to have a little bit more flexibility, maybe even independence. You want to expand your current business, right? You might want to buy more equipment, and you might not have access to all the capital through lines of credit or through other vehicles. And you may want to distribute cash to shareholders. I know some of the younger family business members that we work with might be surprised to even know that that's an option, that cash gets distributed to shareholders after profitable years as a reward for loyalty over years, or in many cases, and many cases in our work, cash is distributed to shareholders in order to cover tax obligations or pay for other needs. The tax obligation question is always an interesting one. We asked families in our seminars over the years to, are you a shareholder in your family business? Raise your hand if you are. And we've been surprised, only early on were we surprised when some half-heartedly raised their hands, the younger generation, and looked towards mom and dad with that question in their face, am I really a shareholder? And in one particular scenario, there was an outright question where a son said, well, Dad, am I? Am I a shareholder? Am I not? And the dad said, do you remember the K-1 statement that you get every April that you sign, and then that we write you a check to cover that tax obligation? Yes, you are a shareholder. So the K-1 obligation, the tax obligation, is one that we see all the time. And then finally, you may want to retire and just not rely on that paycheck and rely on cash coming from the business. So many, many different reasons that you might be here, and we really hope that you get at least one nugget of golden information out of our time together. Because balancing the needs of the business, the capital needs of the business, and the liquidity needs of the family is very important. If you think about the strange dance that is a family business, a dance of emotion on one hand and family relationships and love and harmony and respect and kindness and guiding principles, with all of the very economic and empirically driven factors and success ratios and key performance indicators on the other side, you've got the potential for quite a mess. At the same time, you've got the potential for some of the very best-run businesses and best families in the world, as we see in our client bases. So taking this very carefully, very seriously, a step at a time, and making it a point of discussion with all shareholders and with even some members of the family who may not yet be shareholders but who will become shareholders is really an important process. What is liquidity for most family businesses? One of my mentors is a fellow named John Ward, terrific guy, and he said something 2 years ago in India at a seminar that we were doing that I'll never forget. He said, remember, we're talking about cash, and he said, I know we all talk about cash and profits and revenues, and he said, this is something that I learned from my father years ago. He said, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, but cash is reality. And as I've worked with family businesses over the last 17 years, I just can't underscore and underline how important it is to remember that. And you know it as an entrepreneur or as a family business owner. If you run out of cash, if you don't have liquidity, you may be in a short-term proposition there. So what is it really? And for most family businesses, it means the speed at which we can convert an asset into cash. Okay? Now, we're not talking about getting a maximum price for that asset. We're just talking about how quickly we can get it converted to cash. Being in cash or easily convertible to cash, debt-paying abilities. So being able to cover our debts. And then liquidity for many, especially in the younger and senior years in family business ownership, distributions or dividends are a point of interest. More of a reality in the senior generations and the current generations, and more of a hope in the younger generations as we go forward. So again, we're balancing this idea of liquidity for shareholders and cash to shareholders and cash available for other investments with the idea and the reality that a business has to have capital, especially as the family that owns that business is growing. So I've seen studies done and articles written recently about how fast someone needs to grow their business in order to accommodate the needs of the shareholders as well as the needs of the business, and with the underlying factor that the family is growing quickly, right? So let's take a second before we look at this slide and just think about what's happening in your families. Families grow quickly, right? If mom and dad have a lifestyle that costs about $200,000, let's say, in a year, and the mom and dad have 4 kids, and if the assumption is out there that the business is going to continue to support the needs of the family, either through employment or through distribution, well, you don't have to be very good at math to know that in one generation that $200,000 of lifestyle has turned into $1 million of lifestyle. And I have not seen in any of my work or heard a shareholder, especially a young shareholder, say, I don't want to have as nice and comfortable of a lifestyle as my parents did. I've never heard that. We're all looking to be as good or more comfortable than the standard of living and quality of life that we had growing up. So this brings into question then, what is patient capital, and how do we keep enough capital in the business to provide for the family business the long-term advantages that have always helped family businesses have a little bit of a competitive advantage going forward? So stability of capital structure, right? Another one of my colleagues would say having a war chest, having access to capital, having low debt gives you stability and makes you capable of taking advantage of buying opportunities going forward in your business. The long-term investment strategy. So I wanted to underscore the word strategy there. What is the plan? Where are we going from here with our investments as individuals, as shareholders, but in particular here in the business? Where are our investments going to be? Tangible and intangible return on equity, right? We're putting our equity into this business. What are we getting back on it? In family businesses, often that empirical factor there is lower than in the quarterly driven, publicly owned businesses, and that gives advantage. I work with a family in Texas in the grocery business, who, when they would run return on invested capital analyses, would look at 50-year scenarios, 50-year pro formas. So that return on equity can be stretched out over many, many decades, and that gives advantage. Commitment to all stakeholders, not just shareholders, not just controlling owners, but the idea that stakeholders matter, that long-term employees, suppliers, customers matter. It's a part of a community approach that family businesses often take. And then the presence of family values. What are the guiding principles that we are using to move forward? And one of those guiding principles that we see often in successful business-owning families is the idea that capital needs to be patient, that there shouldn't be a rush for liquidity. But again, it has to be balanced. With that, I'll turn it over to Rebecca to take us forward.
Sure. One of the things I think that dovetails very perfectly from patient capital is also around the evolution of family ownership. And one of the things I like to think of first is let's just think about the evolution of a family. If you think through your own family, you go to your siblings, there's a certain level of relationship there, your cousins beyond that. And oftentimes when we get 2 or 3 generations out, for a lot of families even 1 generation out, we're really no longer tied in any way to some of these people who are part of our family. Now when we put a family business and ownership that transitions over time, that tie becomes much more apparent. We now have a reason to keep people together who otherwise may have moved on and not been together anymore. So when we think about the evolution of family ownership, if we start with generation 1 or stage 1, that's really the easiest one when we think about liquidity, when we think about keeping the business front and center, growing it. You have usually 1 owner, maybe 1 or 2 owners. They're highly in tune with one another. And their main source of liquidity comes from their own compensation. And I've worked with so many business owners that they talk about liquidity and they laugh about where they've come to, because they oftentimes started with either nothing or a very small loan from a family member, payroll on a credit card. So liquidity sources are very different to them, and capital sources tend to primarily come from the business. And then when we think about, as Dana was mentioning, if you start to bring generation 2 in, you start to have some active, maybe some inactive shareholders. Those inactive shareholders look for their cash flow to come from dividends, but you also have these active shareholders who are also wanting a certain lifestyle. And very often, we have owners from stage 1 and 2 in together, stage 2 and 3, or we have some businesses where all of those are together. Really good example of this and why it's so important to plan. Recently met with a family where the first generation had passed away, so they were out of the business, but they had 6 children who were in part of this stage 2, who were all in their mid-60s and starting to look to retire or step out of the business, but they hadn't really adequately planned for that stage. Now we get to stage 3, and they all have children in the business, and these children in stage 3 are in a really tough spot. They're looking to fund the retirement of this next second generation where they don't have the assets for it. And they're trying to balance now, how do I grow this business, how do I maintain this business, and then how do I meet these outside capital needs? So when we start to think about stage 2 and getting more owners in there, it's important to start thinking of your capital sources, business cash flow, but also some external debt, and knowing that the sources of conflict will be with interested and what we call active and inactive shareholders. They may have very different goals, and as that stage 1 owner exits, the conflict between stage 2 owners who are active and inactive can really start to come to the forefront. One of the biggest suggestions I would have for those in stage 2 is to start building a balance sheet outside of the company. Dana talked at the very beginning about diversification. The more as money comes out of a company, you build assets outside of it, it starts to create an environment where the business doesn't have to be the sole source of funding and income for all of the people involved. And then if we really get to stage 3, that's where I like to think about all of my cousins and the ones I see and the ones I don't, and the thought that now you're all together with people who may have grown up in different places, grown up differently, much more likely to have inactive shareholders. And when you look at that, their income is coming from dividends. The capital needs start to become much greater. And oftentimes businesses in these stages are looking for growth, and you're going to have tension now between people who are not just inactive, but maybe very distant from the business, whose benefit of that business ownership is purely in the capital that they get, not really in maybe so much of the emotional tie if the work hasn't been done and the planning hasn't been done to keep them engaged in the company. So from here we move on to what causes pressure for cash. Perfect. And if we really think about it, shareholders who lack emotional attachment or if there's conflict within a family, that starts to cause the pressure for cash. I had a company I did a lot of work with, and really it was an unfortunate case because you had two siblings who one had been involved, had helped grow the business with their father, the other one hadn't. And when the father passed away, the tension between the two of them grew substantially. So the individual in the business started saying, well, I'll take a higher salary, I will run a lot of my personal expenses through here, I will do these things because I feel like I have more right to certain pieces of this business. And their father had really been silent and hadn't necessarily planned or communicated with them what the expectations were. There wasn't a lot of good governance in place for salaries and how someone went about adjusting those things. So what we ended up with is this pressure for cash and a conflict between them rather than two people very invested in the growth of the business. And so when we think about that, what that really leads to is something we call the downward liquidity spiral. We have a relatively illiquid investment. We start having less cash flow generated from that investment. That means there's less capital available to reinvest in the company. And then in turn, we have a demand for a high current return. So if we think about our own investment portfolios, there will be times where it's doing very well. There will be times where we're in a downward market. And if you said to yourself, I have the same demand from this portfolio, regardless of what the market is doing or how things are performing, we would go into that with the understanding that taking money out when things are down is going to harm me long term. When we think about a business, it's very much the same, but then there's the added component that it's generally not a marketable asset. So when we find companies that are stuck in this liquidity spiral, oftentimes it's when the sales start to come onto the table or the discussion of the sale starts to come into the picture. Then you can take us forward one more. So when I think about families selling their businesses, I really think there are certain reasons that you do it that you as the business owner are in control of. You've made some decisions. Maybe you've decided there's not a capable successor and the best thing for the business is to sell it. Maybe the price for the business in the public markets is very appealing. You could reinvest and be outside of that business. There may be a shareholder desire to diversify. All of those reasonings are the things that I think are very much in control, and they're a decision that the business owner or owners get to make. The unfortunate sales are the ones that come from what I call a lack of planning. The sales that are forced or really become the only option because there aren't other options left. So I think about things like the estate tax burden. That is something that can be planned for, and with proper time, we help a lot of our clients plan on how to manage estate taxes, managing how successors will come up, and making sure you have a capable successor if the goal is to maintain that business. But a big one that jumps out around shareholder liquidity demands is there are points where business owners don't see any other options. The demands are too great, and the only way to do that is to force a sale and basically get liquidity into the hands of others. So when we think about selling, whenever I work with a client who wants to sell or wants to look at that or consider that as an option, I want it to be the type of sale that they control the decision making, not the type of sale that failure to plan has created for them.
And Rebecca, I'm going to chime in. I'm thinking about a number of client engagements that I have right now, and realizing that the sale option is brought up often in a sibling generation of ownership and a cousin generation of ownership. And it makes a lot of sense that that option would be brought up. So I want to make 2 points about it before we talk about the potential to just say, let's retain that business. So mom and dad, as you said, started out bootstrapping a company and become surprised when 20 to 25 years later, there are millions of dollars in revenue and assets that have piled up, and often have an estate planning issue or are kind of brought to confront the question of, what do I do with my assets for my kids? Now, let's keep in mind there aren't any legal requirements anywhere that say that we need to give assets to our children when we pass away. But morally, we all pretty much agree that it ought to be done, and we go through the mechanisms to do so. But we pass the business on to our children involuntarily. Let's keep that in mind. I know that it may be a little bit uncomfortable to think about, but I'm thinking about a client that I worked with last week, and one of them said to me privately in the second generation, he said, look, I love my sister. I love her. She's a great mother. She's a wonderful wife to her husband. She's a terrific person. She's an educator in her life. But I would have never chosen her to be my financial partner. I just wouldn't. And that's not in any way a knock on her character or anything. He said, it's just tough for me to be her partner. So the reality of a second generation is that some people are more capable of being productive shareholders, and some people are less capable. Some are more interested in being a productive shareholder, and others are less interested. And so the idea of a buyout before the idea of a sale should really be considered carefully. It's essentially giving people the chance to go and do other things without that kind of big looming question of, why don't we just sell everything and divide it up? Because that's an emotional question, right? The liquidity demands that you talked about, Rebecca, can turn into pretty sticky conflicts pretty quickly, right? I mean, if shareholders, especially siblings, are unhappy with each other and with performance, that's an issue. And that brings the second point I wanted to bring up. Often what's going on in a sibling partnership is that one person in the sibling group is leading the business and in some cases is in control of the business, while the other siblings are minority partners who have little say or control. And that is a very tough dynamic in a group of siblings. If you think about how interesting sibling relationships are and how quickly they can become conflicting and tough, having that pressure inside of having a little brother or a little sister or an older brother or an older sister who's in control of some portion of my destiny is a very tough dynamic to have. So there's lots of reasons to think about selling a business, but there's also lots of reasons to keep the business. And again, we get you to focus here on how to keep the business if it's a good business in a good industry, and that's where this all starts. If it's a good business, good industry with good owners and good leadership, then it certainly makes a lot of sense to talk about how to keep it in the family. Why would families choose to retain businesses? It creates wealth. There's lots of studies been done over time that show that one of the greatest indicators of family wealth is a privately held business. Now, the family's pride in ownership. Many of our clients have their name on the front door. Or on the truck that drives by, right? Or on the sign in front of in the real estate company, and that is a source of pride, and it means a lot. Staying private is a competitive advantage, right? Not having to meet the scrutiny or increased demands of public owners is a great advantage and allows for long-term investment. The desire to pass on opportunities to children, right? All of us as parents, if you have any kids, look at our little ones early on and think, boy, I hope they're happy, and I hope they get a chance to do something meaningful. And many times in family businesses, that is exactly what we can provide for them, is an opportunity for them to learn about the business and to find their place in it. The role of business in keeping the family together. This is incredibly important. They're really, if you think about families, they're defined really by 3 generations in most part, and there's only 3 different things that I can think of that will keep a family close and together for 3 generations. One of them is a family business. It's a glue. Another would be kind of a property or a location somewhere, a cabin or a lake, and then on a lake or a beach house. The third one is some sort of a philanthropy, right? Some sort of a foundation that brings the family together. So keeping the business in the family helps keep the family together. And the fear that passive wealth could harm family values and work ethic. Outside investors bring different ideas about guiding principles and core values and different ideas about profit. Now, that's not to say that's bad, but in many cases, families would rather protect the guiding principles that they've used to create the success that they've created. And then the concern that investing in new areas is more risky than maintaining business. I work with a real estate family right now, and they said, we don't put money anywhere else anymore because it changed our motto. Our motto used to be buy low and sell high, but as soon as we got into other businesses, we realized our new motto was becoming buy high and sell low, and they weren't happy about it. So focusing on core competencies is a compelling reason. The real financial question here is if I sell a business that's generating cash, how am I going to replace that cash? Because if I get a chunk of change and pay taxes on it in some cases, where am I going to put it that I'm going to have the same rate of return, the same return on capital, and the same feeling of control over that? And that's a very, very tough question.
And Dana, I think that's a really good point as well. In working with business owners, when they're looking at the potential of selling, one of the things we do with them is some in-depth cash flow planning. You're used to where your cash flow comes from, and oftentimes the amount that they'll have, particularly after taxes, cannot replace the cash flow that they've come to count on from that company. So part of that decision to sell also is if I think this is a good long-term cash flow play and I think it's sustainable, perhaps selling that asset isn't the right thing to do, but rather finding a way to transition management in a way where you can continue with that.
Great point, Rebecca. I mean, I think I can imagine you sitting with clients saying, there's some multiple out there, right, where whether it's 10 times free cash flow, that if we can get that offer and we feel confident, then it makes a lot of sense to think about cashing out of this business. But in most other cases, I agree with you. When you really put a pencil to it, you think, where is this cash going to come from? Now, there's one client that I work with down in Texas for many years, been in the car business, and he talks about something together with me that we've named return on calories expended as a kind of a measurement of success. And he's one to say, the decision to sell will come for him when he feels like the return on the calories that he's expending in a day in a particular business or a car dealership in his case are just, it's too low. You're spending, 90% of your time on one particular problem that's only generating, say, 5%, of your annual return. So I like that also. He calls it return on calories expended. Now, the question again of patient capital, it's based in the notion, or really the need for the family to be on the same page. So whether you want to call it, ownership unity here or maybe harmony as families get bigger and bigger, the idea of harmony makes a little bit more sense to me. But unity, right? I mean, are we cohesive and motivated and committed enough to pursuing the same goals that we're willing to take risks together and build this business for the future? What that can create is what we would call the family effect, right? The positive, almost kind of almost like a positive whipping motion of centripetal force. That's too much of an analogy. That is stretching for that one, but something that gives us more going forward than the sum of the individual pieces. And what can the family effect come from? Because the family effect, again, if that means unity and harmony in the family and the ownership group, how do you create it? Well, again, let's assume that the family is getting bigger and more complicated. Okay, there's more people that are being born, and there's more people that are marrying into the family. So you've just suddenly got a communication issue to start with. You can't even really talk at the same time about these kinds of questions of return and growth and liquidity and profit and goals without a full-blown calendaring event where people are looking 3 or 4 months out into the future to say, we're going to get together on this day and we're going to focus. So scheduling regular gatherings, right, regular times to get together, to talk together, to learn together, and also just to play together. I mean, families that spend a lot of time together have higher trust factors in them, and when we trust people that we work with more, we're all going to be more productive and more comfortable taking risks. Develop shareholder education programs. So shareholders and potential shareholders need to understand what that means. They need to understand the structure of the business, need to understand the measures of success in that business, right? What's a free cash flow statement? What's an income statement? What's a balance sheet? And reviewing business results together. This is some of the funnest, most kind of energetic meetings that I've been involved in over my career are when the current generation starts to open the books, appropriately to the next generation, say, this is what you're involved in. This is how much revenue comes through. This is how many employees there are. This is the history of the business. These are big decisions that have been made. These are big sales that have been made. These are problems that have been overcome. And what it does is it shows the next generation 2 things. One, they're involved in something special, or at least they have the potential to be involved in something special. And more importantly, it helps them start to see that there is a myriad of problems coming at owners, and that if they want to be involved and gain benefit going forward, they need to create the mentality in themselves of being a problem solver and helping to solve problems. Talking about business trends and strategy, and I've seen some really creative ways to talk with young people about strategy, whether it's using a chess match or kind of a castle game to talk about how do we make sure that somebody doesn't kind of overrun our kingdom when we're in a time of weakness. Discuss the responsibility of the business to its stakeholders, right? Boy, I learned early on in my career that the controlling owner founder who's run a business for 30 years is intensely loyal to the long-term employees who have, as they would put it, been out in the foxholes with me, have gone to war with me and come back bloodied and tired out, but victorious. Those are the people that they pay a lot of attention to. Of course, the family's important, but they want to show to the next generation so often that it's a responsibility, it's a stewardship to the people that are also kind of tying their horse to the family's business wagon and going forward out into the prairie. Developing a statement of family values, right? Shareholders need to have a sense of what principles they're using, and sometimes that needs to be redefined a little bit or refreshed between generations. Preparing a family mission statement. I would say on this one, the next generation, as you bring in more people into your ownership group, it's so important to stop and ask the question and then answer the question together, why are we doing this? Why are we risking our capital? Why are we coming to work every day? Why are we taking phone calls on Saturday night at 10 o'clock? Why are we doing this? What's the driving purpose that makes us do this because we have other options? It's so important to gather that unity. And then finally, develop a family constitution and business governance structure. Right? How are we going to manage the family's relationship to the business? How are we going to get the owners up to speed in their education, whether they're current or future? And how are we going to make sure that we create expectations now so that when we get into real discussions, tough discussions in the future, that the chance of us getting into real conflict is minimized? So, as planning goes, and as we define these different, as we make the plans, and as we think about liquidity, as we think about capital, it's important to remember that the planning process in the family and in the ownership group can be done in parallel with the business governance and the strategic planning for the business. Now, it takes coordination, absolutely. It takes meeting times and calendaring, absolutely. It also means there needs to be some structure in the family, right? We help families create family councils, for instance, that helps them manage their family's relationship to their business. And that family council can have members of the leadership team from the business on it, as long as they're family members. They could have owners from the board and from the shareholders group on it, so that there is this kind of easy give and take of information and planning that happens in a parallel way. Because really, all of this means good governance, whether it's on the family side or the business side, and that is family's vision and mission, the company's vision and mission, the structures that are being put in place to help the process, and then the policies and creating the expectations. So it's really the whole group saying together, who are we and what are we trying to accomplish, where do we want to go, how are we going to get there, what are the guiding principles that we're going to use to get us there. Now, again, back to the question of liquidity and the need for liquidity. What are some of the factors that tend to increase shareholders' demands? Death of a shareholder, right? So any of you that have gone through the creation of a shareholders agreement or buy-sell agreement know that there are four kind of, I guess, Ds that are brought up early on. What about death? What about divorce? What about disability? And the fourth one would be, increasingly, what about drug dependency, alcohol abuse, a disability that comes kind of by behavior. By the way, the CEO of a family business is 7 times more likely to become disabled while in that role than he or she is to die in that role. So the importance of thinking through disability and insurance coverages is exceptionally important. Especially, think about it, in the controlling owner-founder stage. If you started your business and you've been running your business for 20 to 25 years, and if your business is what I would call a high-touch, high-customization business, if you're building homes, if you're a CPA, if you are a doctor, if you have high-touch, high-visibility with your customers, and if your name is very much associated with the value of the business, you've really got to think carefully about what would happen with your demise or your disability. Divorce, we all know divorce is a potential problem, not just financially, but in terms of pulling energy, positive energy out of an owner's group and a business and focusing it on someone who's hurting in the family and going through a very, very tough time. Personal financial bankruptcy. I mean, we've lived through the Great Recession, and we know that things can change quickly, and planning for liquidity needs on the other side of bankruptcy, or making sure that we don't go into bankruptcy, needs cash, right? Business ventures, great opportunities. I have a family that I work with that has created a new ventures fund, right, where they have taken money outside of profits and placed it in a fund that the next generation can use if they can convince the controlling shareholders to put into new business ventures and new opportunities. And a lot of times those businesses, by the way, are closely connected to the core business, right? They're supportive businesses or they're ancillary businesses to the core business. And that's how a lot of business empires get built over time. And then other personal financial crises. More of them. I mean, there's lots of things that can happen, right? What if the family's cohesiveness and commitment is declining? This is real trouble can come if the shareholders group starts to have conflict around distribution amounts or leadership questions. Who should run the business in the next generation? And all of these things, again, can create a focus, a negative focus, a destructive focus that potentially can make it so the best workers, the best employees, best managers in the business who are non-family managers would start to think, maybe I better get out of here, maybe I better look elsewhere. And this is all going to kind of cycle into the potential for lower profitability and lower cash at the end of a fiscal year, and just more trouble in that downward cycle that Rebecca talked about earlier. Conflicts. Heavy dependence by shareholders on the income from the business. This is a big one, okay? This fellow, I told you the story earlier, who said, I love my sister, but I wouldn't want to be in business with her if I had the choice. A lot of that was driving his frustration was a fairly consistent request by his sister for more cash to come through the business so that she could increase her comforts in life, really is what it came down to. More vacations, a nicer home, nicer cars, and it created a tremendous tension, and we're right in the middle of it, frankly, right now, about saying where does the spigot turn off? Where do the needs of the shareholders stop and the wants of the shareholders begin, and how do we gauge that? And really it starts with a question of stewardship, okay? How are we going to protect this business into the next generation means how are we going to keep the capital structure strong? Concentration of shareholders in the same age group, right? If transition is coming, we're going to need liquidity in order to get things taken into that next generation through buyouts because right, the current generation is going to be real interested in making sure that their retirement is funded. Others, shareholder disappointment in current returns. Okay, now this is something that we often lose sight of in family business. If I was given shares in a family business, again, I'm not a voluntary shareholder, I'm an involuntary shareholder. As I grow and learn and develop and maybe get business training, I realize that I have assets that are invested in a private company that in shares that are really not marketable, and I might start to think that I'd like to get some of those out and put them somewhere else. Well, the question becomes, what would I do with that cash? What would the return be that I could realistically garner? And then a comparison is called into play between the return on the capital, and a lot of times that's measured in terms of cash, right? If I'm getting a return on capital, but it's only being, represented by a K-1 statement and a check that I have to write out for taxes, at some point, shareholders like to see cash come back to them, and there's nothing wrong or evil or dastardly about that. That's economics 101. Lack of shareholder access to value appreciation. Right. Again, economic questions in the midst of an emotional system. Lackluster total return on equity. Again, what are we comparing it to? And is it realistic to have shares liquidated to get into something else? A shareholder need to diversify. There's lots of businesses that were great businesses recently that are terrible businesses going forward. The Blockbuster Videos of the world, the pager companies that were taken out of business by cell phone companies. The changing, I saw a headline the other day about Google maybe taking over credit cards, something, what seems crazy and almost impossible, but there are a lot of things that change in business because the rewards for the innovators are very big. And then reinvestment opportunities elsewhere for shareholders as well. So these, again, many, many demands that can lead a family to think about liquidity in a very, very serious way.
And now, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I think as we start looking at options for liquidity, internal options, external options, when you look back through this list, what I found is families that successfully contemplate these issues, what would happen in the event of a divorce, contemplate these issues before they start handing stock out, getting buy-sell agreements in place. There's the emotional piece, and then there's the tactical as to how do I go about managing this. For families that do that in advance, they can contemplate a lot of these issues when they're not in the midst of a very emotional time where someone may be going through something. And there's always still flexibility, but if you think about them in advance, it gives you the ability to plan in a way where you can at least hope to, with each generation, manage some of the things that we know are just consistent sources of conflict in family businesses throughout time. So when we think about capital, a lot of businesses have looked internally for capital. And what I would stress is the companies that are able to do this really tend to have very strong balance sheets, they have very good cash flow, and they have a very good understanding as to if it's cashing someone out, for instance, an installment repurchase of stock, what they can afford to do and what they can afford to offer someone without harming the business itself. The other thing to contemplate with each of these is who is it available to? Is there a certain type of shareholder? How, if everyone came to get their shares redeemed at the same time, how would the company handle that? You know, I think a really big one, and it's the idea of shareholders wanting a return. I think Dana mentioned that. At some point, everybody would like to receive some sort of cash. And if all I ever receive are dividends where I just get a tax check to pay on top of that and there's nothing really cash-wise in it for me, my chance of becoming more disenfranchised goes up. So in years when it is possible, I think paying those dividends, looking at company-sponsored programs that allow you to buy in to the company or buy out shares of others who may be wishing to exit. Also looking at employee stock ownership plans. ESOPs are very popular. What I do find is statistically about 90% of the companies that contemplate an ESOP actually don't go down that path for a variety of reasons. You're bringing in a whole different type of partner. But for the ones that do, it's very important that you work with very credible individuals, help you get it set up, understand exactly what you're doing, because a lot of ESOPs do end up being unwound in the first 5 years as well. So it's a very viable opportunity, but it takes a lot of education to make sure you're doing the right thing before you go down that path. And then, as we said, division of assets or recapitalization, distributing shares amongst a new generation. But all of these internal sources still require that there is enough adequate capital and adequate cash flow to allow the business to continue while funding funding these things. When we compare this with our outside financing options, we start to talk about a different type of financing. And there's a variety of ways that outside financing comes in. Oftentimes we think about where a bank comes in. We have businesses that have seasonal cash flows. Maybe in a retail business, there are reasons that their cash flow is seasonal, and they may use financing such as bank lines. They tend to be short-term, the rates tend to float, and they're really there to provide a need for a certain time frame. When we go next to what we might call bridge capital, that's the type of financing that companies take on for longer-term projects. We're building a building, we have a new plant. It can be bank financing, it can come from institutional debt, and typically they tend to go over the life of the project, but still not a really long-term type of financing. Some business owners are very opposed to financing. I think I've talked to numerous business owners who have done a lot of work to pay off debt early on and don't like the idea of it. But I think this is where that next generation that's looking to grow the business, or in conjunction with that first generation, there are a lot of good reasons to take on debt when it's done strategically. And when we think about bank financing, the ability to expand is really where the bank can partner with its clients to help them do that. We then move into what we call transitional capital or strategic capital, and private equity is a big source of this. A lot of my clients have used private equity as a way to partially monetize their business, and then subsequently with those private equity firms taking the company public, and so they're now the shareholder of a public company. Like all partners, you need to be very thoughtful about why you're doing it, who you're partnering with, and what their expectations are. The benefit of patient capital over time is, as Dana said, some companies look at a 50-year cash flow. When you start to work with private equity, they have to get a certain return for their investors as well. So a 5-year time frame could be even a long time frame for private equity. So as a business owner, being attuned to how that changes your strategy and if it's something that you're going to be comfortable with. And then finally, strategic capital is where strategic partners or other investors come in, and these are the type of partners that are really looking to be part of the business, to participate in the business, and it's putting, I like to say that's a combining of assets to take something to the next stage. So as you think about outside financing options, really asking yourself what you're trying to accomplish, what level of involvement it brings someone else into your business, and understanding really the details of how that might change your dynamic or your strategy and what you'll be held to going forward. So when we think about family businesses that have successfully transitioned this patient capital for each generation, there are some key hallmarks. The first one is they have a business that is performing. It's creating value for their shareholders. They're able to pay their dividends, there's cash flow, and I think this is really a key point, is if you have a business that you think isn't either sustainable over time or you think it may have reached its max potential, those are the types of businesses people look to sell. If you think that this can continue to create value for the family, there are a lot of good reasons to hold on to it. They also have programs that allow shareholders to exit, that allow people out. I love the line in this, which is patient capital is not trapped capital. And the more that there is a system in place for shareholders who do not wish to be in to exit, the more harmony we continue to keep among the other shareholders. And then finally, they have invested the time and the effort in putting in strong family governance, making sure that the values are carried from generation to generation. Some of the best experiences I've been a part of is watching family history and the history of that entrepreneurship and passing that story down as each generation comes in, knowing who started it, where they came from and why, and what values have been passed down. These are the ways that you get people who are genuinely invested in their family business. And so when we think about the family effect, the benefit of family effect is you have unlimited committed ownership. For those who are committed, you have a lot of different owners in there. The cost of capital is significantly lower. And in the end, you have dramatically increased shareholder value with companies that have been passed down and have been well managed through each of those generational changes. Dana, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
A story just came into my mind that my dad and I used to talk about. I'm mechanically disinclined. I don't know how to fix anything really, but I remember a story that he told me about an engine. He said when you're trying to figure out how an engine works, it has 4 different parts to it. He called it pump, squeeze, pop, and blow. He said you pump fuel into a cylinder, you squeeze it down, you ignite it, and then you let the exhaust out. And I've thought over and over the years as I've worked with family businesses that a family business system is really like an engine, right? I mean, it's got pressure in it and it's got emotion, it's got strength. But without some sort of an exhaust system in a family business, it's what an engine is without an exhaust system. It's like a bomb, right? I mean, it's conflict and it's emotion, and it can explode. And if you think about what we've talked about here with liquidity and cash and kind of treating the shareholders fairly and appropriately, as well as treating the business fairly and appropriately, that balance is in a lot of ways like an exhaust system, right? If you've got shareholders that don't want to be in there, or shareholders that want more cash and they're starting to kind of get agitated, using liquidity internally, preferably, as you said, to help kind of alleviate some of that pressure, ultimately it gets more power out of the engine. So I don't know if that's a dumb analogy or not, but it just popped into my head. And I think, I hope that all of you listeners have have gotten at least one thing out of this that can help you balance that really tough balance between the needs of the business for capital and the needs of the shareholders for cash. And I've enjoyed this, Rebecca. Thanks for being on here with me. And yeah, everybody have a great rest of your day, night, morning, or whatever you're involved in.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. We hope you will join us for our next presentation.
Thanks to all our participants for joining us today. We hope you found this webcast presentation informative. This concludes our webcast. You may now disconnect. Have a good day.